Good afternoon, everyone. This week, we're going to be continuing our discussion of Fadiman's The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down. And last week, we began to look at some of the cultural differences between Leah's parents and her doctors. And in particular, the way in which those cultural differences impact the way in which the doctors and Leah's parents want to treat Leah's epilepsy. I want to continue that idea, but I want to add on to it a discussion of the way in which this sense of difference, that is, those cultural barriers, are informed and exacerbated by cultural prejudices about the Hmong. So we're going to be talking about the idea of the other as a philosophical concept, and we're going to consider how it may be working in this story in the case of Leah and Leah's parents. I should also just mention that my notes are off to the right-hand side. So you might notice me periodically looking off to the side in the course of this lecture. And the reason why is that I'm checking my notes. All right, you guys may have learned about the idea of the other in perhaps a sociology or a history class. I want to talk about how it works here. Let's get some definitions down on the table first. Otherness, or the other, is a concept that was developed by philosophers to describe how it is that people relate to one another on both an individual level and also a group level. And in particular, philosophers argue that people relate to other people based on their own sense of self and group belonging in relation to what they perceive as being people that either are kind of part of their group or part of another group. So I want to show you the slide that I created. What you'll see is a visual representation of this idea of how this sense of self and belonging is created. So for an individual or a group, they imagine themselves in relation to an outside world or to other people. So here's what happens, though, when we talk about the other. What's occurring is that an individual or group is coding another group as being socially different from them and therefore unassimilable. So what they do when they designate a group as the other is they signal that group's nonconformity to their social norms and values. And then they push that group off to the margins of society, so that what you end up with is an individual or a group. Usually it's like culturally dominant group. And what they've done, if they've taken another less dominant group and they've sort of shunted them off to the margins of society. When they do that, what happens is that this group that's coded as other becomes disenfranchised politically, economically, and socially, with the result that they actually remain marginalized and misunderstood. By this, I might mean that that the other is basically disenfranchised overtly, which means they might not be able to vote. They may not have access to good educational opportunities or good jobs, or they may be the victims of violence by members of the dominant group. Those are just a few ways in which they can become marginalized. But we see less overt ways in which the other becomes and remains marginalized, which is that a dominant group may distrust the other. They may also judge the language, the values, or the social practices of the other as being both different and lesser than their own. That is, that they see their practices as being different, and then they offer a moral judgment upon those practices. And what happens oftentimes is both overt and less overt means work together to maintain this power structure that's going on. Because when we talk about the other or the act of othering a person or a group, we're really talking about the way that a dominant group creates and maintains their own power over another group by coding that group as different and then also inferior. All right, so any dominant group can other another group. But in America, when we tend to think about the other, we tend to think about that dominant group as being white, Western, male, heterosexual, wealthy, powerful, and Christian, specifically Protestant. And when we think about the other that this dominant group creates, that other is typically a group that is defined by their difference. So typically, they are non white people, they're non Westerners, they're non male. They're either female, they're queer, or they're trans. They're non heterosexual, they're not particularly wealthy, and they're typically not Christian. Um, what we see here is that groups can get othered in terms of their gender, sexuality, their race, their religion, their socioeconomic status, and their cultural difference. And that becomes particularly important when thinking about um, the Lees and also the Hmong more generally. So, what we find with these differences is that the differences in otherness tend to intersect and collide with one another. And here's how I see them intersecting. Basically, there are, as you can tell, different stacked categories by which a dominant group is defining themselves. So the further you fall outside of those categories, the more you will experience a sense of difference, of othering, and of disenfranchisement. And I'll give you an example. A black man is oftentimes defined as the other in American society, and they suffer concomitant disenfranchisement, both economic, social, and political. Um, Now, that sense of disenfranchisement and of difference will be more keenly felt by a black heterosexual woman than by a black man, most likely. And the reason is that that woman is sort of doubly differentiated from the dominant group in that she's racially different and she's also sexually different, right? She's not a male, she's a female. Now, um, the black heterosexual woman will experience a sense of difference. That sense of difference is even greater, or is even more experienced by a black woman who's not heterosexual. And again, the idea is that she falls further and further from those categories of the dominant group. She's racially different. She's different by virtue of her gender, because she's female, not male, and she's also different by virtue of her sexuality because she's not heterosexual, she's homosexual. And so this is an idea of intersectionality that we see occurring not simply in terms of race, but we can see it occurring in terms of other compounded sense of differences as well. Here's what I mean about elided. The way in which the dominant group tends to talk about themselves, or tends to talk about themselves and their difference from other groups, tends to be in terms that are become ambiguous, and they tend to conflate with one another. So the dominant group typically describes themselves as being strong and powerful, often masculine, brave, smart, wealthy, moral, good citizens, you name it. They get the good qualities. But the way that they define other groups is by their difference and their contradiction from those qualities. So oftentimes a dominant group will define the other as exotic, feminized, incomprehensible, alien, unintelligent, crazy, deviant, criminal, primitive or primeval, not a good citizen, lazy or mooching. And oftentimes these terms get stacked onto one another in ways that don't always make sense, except to sort of the dominant group. And this is actually particularly true, we find, with the way that Americans think about Asian culture, or the way that Westerners have traditionally thought about Asian culture. First of all, when Westerners think of Asian culture, they tend to create a dichotomous difference. Dichotomy means two. So by that, I mean that they tend to say that they tend to talk about sort of polar opposites. You have Western culture and you have Eastern culture. And then because they're doing this, we see other ways in which they other Asians. We tend to think about it in at least three ways. When Westerners think about quote Eastern culture, they tend to homogenize it. By that, I mean that dominant Western culture, or in situations where they're dominant, they tend to think that all Asian groups and all Asian cultures are the same, when in fact they're incredibly different from one another, right? We know that, Chinese people are not the same as South Koreans. And we also know that within Chinese culture, there's a variety of different other cultures that are going to vary by region, by just origins, by language, but those differences tend to get collapsed. Um, in addition, when Western culture is dominant, they tend to think of Asian culture in feminized terms. And by this, I mean that they tend to um, relegate Eastern cultures to the role of the subjugated um, when they discuss it, with the result that Westerners are defining themselves as dominant, therefore masculine. When they consider a subjugated group, they consider that group in feminized terms. And then third is that when Western culture is dominant, they tend to essentialize Asian culture. By this, I mean that they tend to reduce Asian cultures down to their kind of essential or quote universal characteristics, seeing those characteristics as being kind of unchanging over time. So when they do that, what happens is that they collapse um, that strong sense of of historical evolution that's going on, and they tend to then not see um, other individuals or groups that they define as other. They tend to not see them as being historical actors whose culture is changing over time in the exact same way that their own culture is changing over time. And this is actually particularly true of the Hmong, who Fadiman describes as being regarded by members of the Merced community, and even, quite frankly, other Asian cultures in which they live as being sort of primitive or primeval or really super backward. Um, so the idea of the other becomes really important in terms of how and why Fadiman represents the Lees as she does, and also their doctors as she does. Because she's arguably trying to break us out of that mold of seeing the Hmong and the Lees as being the other, while trying to show us, her readers, um, how othering affects Leah's care. And the Hmong are a really sort of unique group um, to consider this idea of othering, because they are considered others. She argues, not just by members of the Merced community or America in general, but by other Asians. In fact, they have a history of having been sort of always considered the other. Um, and by this, she says that they have a long history of, disenfranchisement from more dominant groups, and also violence against their groups for their way of life. She says that they have, a long history also of being exploited by dominant cultures, from China to Laos to Vietnam to the United States. And she suggests that this long history of being marginalized has contributed to their sense of group identity and to the way in which, that group sees the world and makes decisions within it. And she invites us then to consider the kinds of barriers that exist to Leah's care as a result of this sense of othering. And in particular, she talks about there being both structural and kind of cultural barriers. So the structural barriers um, include the terms by which the Lees arrive in the U.S. and the structure by which our government has basically served them. So she points out that the Lees, like other Hmong, are refugees. When they're in the refugee camps, they have almost no preparation for entering into to U.S. cultural life. They're not taught English. They're not taught how to read. They're not taught how to write. They're not taught how to tell time, and they're not taught how to read numbers. And in addition, when basically the U.S. government decides that when they're bringing over refugees, what they're going to do is they're going to move them into large urban areas and initially try to bring them into places where there's not all that many Hmong. So they might move like a family of 10 to, to some area in rural, or to some small city in like Kentucky where there's very few other Hmong. And the idea behind that is that they want them to be in an area that has pretty good access to social services, but they also want them to assimilate into U.S. culture. Um, but what she points out is that because of the way that they've been moved to the US, the Hmong are being set up essentially to not be able to operate very well within US society. So, because they are primarily farmers but have been moved to an urban area, it's hard for them to get jobs. Because they've received no language training, it's hard to get jobs, and it's hard to be able to do things like get a driver's license or even be able to access social services or when access to be able to fully utilize them. And in addition, because of that, what the Hmong experience, she argues, is a sense of great kind of isolation from American culture and also a distrust of American culture, and a strong sense of kind of disenfranchisement from that culture, but also just a strong sense of uneasiness and even incompetence. We hear Fua talking about this quite a bit, that she feels like she kind of can't be a sort of useful member of society because her skill set doesn't translate. And she can't really kind of navigate American culture all that well. As a result, again, she tends to distrust a lot of American culture, and she and her husband really try and hold on to, you know, t- to their cultural values, to their cultural practices. Um, Now, in addition to the sort of structural differences, there's also a set of cultural and relational differences. And by this, I mean that the Merced community considers the Hmong refugees as being both unintelligent and unintelligible, in the sense that they can't understand what they're saying, but they also don't understand what they're doing. They don't understand their cultural practices. As a result, they tend to think of the Hmong refugees as being really backward. And so Fadiman talks about instances where the community has noted that, that the Hmong don't take care of their apartments very well, that they, grow strange vegetables by the side of the road, that they're not wearing proper clothing. And, so they don't sort of understand them, and they consider them thus sort of disruptive. And this sense of difference is exacerbated when it comes to the case of Leah, because her doctors other her parents in sort of a couple of ways. One is that they think of them in some sense as being, unintelligent and unintelligible. In addition, they also seem to be increasingly, over the course of Leah's treatment, ascribing moral characteristics to them. So the doctors consider, Leah's parents as being morally inferior, in the sense that they find them deceitful and distrustful, and even sometimes sort of deliberately contradictory, and they're not sure why. And they also are reading Leah's parents as being bad or kind of inferior parents who are sort of so incompetent that that they not only don't have their daughter's best interests at heart, but actually are a danger to their daughter. And we see that when Dr. Ernst petitions the court to have Leah removed from her parents and put into foster care. Now, the result of these ideas that the doctors have about Leah's parents is that it impacts the way that Leah's parents see the doctors, and concomitantly the way that they understand and respond to the doctor's recommendations on Leah's care. So we find that the doctors oftentimes take actions that are based on a misreading of Leah's parents and their cultural values. And then the Lees respond by oftentimes sort of listening to politely to the doctors, but just sort of going about and doing the thing that they think is best, or by oftentimes kind of openly revolting against the doctors. And so what happens is that sense of mistrust seems to be building and building and building to the point that the relationship between Leah's parents and Leah's doctors is broken. And one of the things that Fadiman's work in some ways seeks to do is to show that difference, to ask us to think about kind of why it arose, and sort of, is someone to kind of blame for it, and to consider the effects of that difference. Because Fadiman notes that there are individuals within the community that understand and take the Lees seriously. And those include Leah's social worker, Leah's foster parents, and also ultimately Fadiman herself. those people are able to translate the Lees are able to translate Western culture in a way that the Lees understand, and can make it seem more comprehensible. But they're also able to translate the Lees and the Lees responses um, to her community, her medical community, in ways that those responses then seem more comprehensible. But as we can see, it comes too late for Leah, and Leah's the one that that ultimately experiences the consequences of this misunderstanding. All right, I want to continue this discussion on the discussion board, and I will look forward to hearing what you have to say about the text. Thank you very much.